Inside a massive government ERP implementation, how DeepSeek is changing the AI sector, and inside another massive SAP failure. These are just a few of the topics we'll cover here in episode 208 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 208. This is the podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. It's the independent, tech-agnostic view of the digital strategy space, including the people, process, technology sides of transformations. My name's Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps the clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. I'm your host today, and joining me is my co-host, as always, is Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for this week's episode.
Me too. It's going to be a great episode, and appreciate you, the audience, being here as well. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments as we go through today's episodes, but we've got a lot to cover here today. We're going to get into some social media questions that we've received recently. We're going to cover some newsworthy topics, including DeepSeek, which is really disrupting the AI space. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. stock market lost over $1 trillion as a result of the disruption that became public with DeepSeek. So we'll talk about what that means to the AI space. And then we'll also talk about UK-based faculty AI and how it's making waves in the education sector. And then later in the show, after we cover the social media questions, newsworthy topics as well, we'll have our guest on the show, Patterson, who's the Executive Vice President of the EMEA region here at Third Stage Consulting. He's going to join me to talk about the Matrix ERP project, which is the UK government's massive ERP project that they recently started. They're moving over to Workday, and we're going to unpack that case study and talk about some of the risks they can expect and talk about some of the challenges they're likely to face, and really unpack that case study here with Aaron later in this episode. And then finally, later in the show, after Aaron's on, we're also going to talk about another failure, which is a recently public announcement or a public revelation that Spar Group, which is an organization based in EMEA, they are a retailer, food retailer, and they had a massive SAP failure. So we're going to talk about that case study later in the show as well. But before we get to all that, a couple quick things. New episodes of the show every Wednesday. You can go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to see past episodes of the show. You can keep up with upcoming episodes. You can also subscribe to this podcast by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can find all the platforms that we broadcast to, both audio and video, at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And then last but not least, the show is produced by Major Tom Productions. If you'd like to sponsor or learn more about how you can collaborate with us on this podcast, feel free to reach out to reach out to Amy. I've included her contact information below. And then we will also include information about that. And then finally, this show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent consulting firm that helps clients with digital transformations throughout the world, including the EMEA region, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about here today later in the show. But before we get to all the stuff we've got to get to here today, Darian, you've got some social media questions. What have you got in store for us?
Yeah, I do. This first one's a good one. It is, I am transitioning from a legal career to a consulting job. How will AI impact me as a budding consultant?
Good question. Well, I think it's going to change. AI is going to change the way you work as a consultant for sure, in terms of how you analyze information, how you produce deliverables and things of that nature. Stuff that we as consultants have historically spent a lot of time on, AI is now going to automate that. And so you could argue that there's some value or some automation of our jobs that could threaten us, right, as consultants, because now, if we're used to billing time to create PowerPoint presentations or to analyze documents or whatever the case may be, we're going to spend a lot less time, or we should be spending a lot less time doing it because we have AI now to help us do that and help us do it faster and better. So on one hand, you think, okay, that's a disruption. That means there might be less consulting dollars to go around as it relates to some of the stuff we've historically done. But I think that's going to be offset by the fact that now organizations are trying to figure out how they can use AI as well. And that creates a whole nother line of opportunity for consultants. So I think it's probably a wash in the long term. I think, yes, it's going to disrupt our profession. Yes, it's going to change it dramatically here in the next couple of years, even more than it already has. But I think it's also going to create a lot of opportunity, because it's anytime technology changes and anytime organizations are forced to change, that's exactly where consulting value comes in. So I don't think the consulting market is going anywhere anytime soon. Although I will say, if you're more of a developer type and you're used to coding, that is more of a risk, I'd say, because that's where AI can really automate and speed things up without necessarily the offsetting benefit of, being able to create more coding or development, because that's not the case. It's AI in many cases is streamlining that whole process. So I'm surely or clearly just speculating what I think will happen, but it'll be curious to see how that unfolds. But that's my knee-jerk reaction to what I think will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of what's going to happen in the future with AI, that kind of leads us to our next question. This question is, every new technology experiences cycles of hype, often followed by either a dramatic decline, like an AI winter, or a shift toward practical focused applications. Which path do you think large language models will take?
I don't know. It's hard to imagine at this early stage of the life cycle of AI. It's hard to imagine a world where AI just goes away or becomes obsolete. I know, I'll back up for a second. I mean, early in my career, like I can remember as far as I can, when I was early in my career, I remember people talking about the death of ERP. I talk about it still. I talk about how I think ERP is going to die. I think there's a lot of risk or a lot of deficiencies with the traditional ERP model. So I think it's sort of, in my opinion, dying a slow death, but it hasn't happened nearly as fast as I thought it would. So it's hard to imagine AI in its acceleration of adoption and things that are happening right now. It's hard to see or imagine what would happen on the other side, or it's hard to see or imagine a situation where there's not a need for it, or where the need precipitates. So, or where it drops off. So I don't know. We'll have to see, but I think it's going to be around for a long time. I don't, but then again, who knows? There might be some new cooler technology in 10 years that none of us can fathom at this point that might completely disrupt the AI space. Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it looks like the AI winter, instead of maybe not using it at all, maybe could just shift a bit of how we're using it too in the future. That would be interesting to see as well, because it is so early still.
Yeah, or if AI just becomes like a sort of a foregone conclusion that any technology has AI and it's sort of just baked into it. Sort of like cloud. I feel like cloud isn't going to go away, but I think the whole focus on cloud will go away just because that's just the way it is. It doesn't matter that it's cloud, because if every system's in the cloud, you're not going to talk about it being in the cloud. But we're talking about it now because companies are transitioning to the cloud and a lot of people still aren't there. So, I think over time, maybe AI just becomes, it just is. It's just part of any technology you use.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess this kind of leads into our newsworthy topic of the day. So the first newsworthy topic we have of the day, you mentioned earlier, is about DeepSeek. This is a Chinese startup that is rapidly emerging as a game changer in the AI sector by launching models that rival top US counterparts at a fraction of the cost. So the company claims that its DeepSeek V3 model was trained for under $6 million using NVIDIA H800 chips, significantly undercutting the massive investments by the US tech giants. DeepSeek's AI assistant has surged in popularity, surpassing ChatGPT as the top-rated free app on Apple's US App Store. This rapid rise has sparked concerns about the efficiency of large AI investments by major tech firms and has even impacted stock prices, like you mentioned, Eric, including NVIDIA's. With its cost-effective yet powerful AI models, DeepSeek is challenging the dominance of US tech leaders and reshaping the global AI landscape. This is a big question that I have for you, Eric. Is this what we start to see a major power shift in AI potentially.
Yeah, it could be, and it sort of ties into a broader global power, struggle that I think a lot of the world is caught up in. You've got the Western world or a lot of the Western world, including the U.S. and UK and other Western countries that are concerned about China and its impact on the world. I think I think there's probably a bit of paranoia there because China is such a strong country. It's emerging, it's growing fast, it's becoming more and more relevant in the world and dominant in the world. And I think it's a threat to the incumbent superpowers like the US, the UK, et cetera. So I think that's probably part of it. Part of that is, in my opinion, the underlying cause of why people are concerned about DeepSeek. And of course, there's also there's the whole concern about data privacy and intellectual property, which historically, there's been tension between China and other countries around intellectual property and privacy of information and whatnot. So I think that just sort of taps into that fear that was already there. I am curious though with DeepSeek. I'm curious because I think there was just after that all happened with DeepSeek and it sort of disrupted the global stock markets and sort of gave people concerns around, wow, we thought ChatGPT or OpenAI was the AI model, but it turns out China has developed this lower cost, more effective, more efficient AI model. Since that news came out, I think there's also been follow-up news, though, that they've actually spent more than they initially indicated on the infrastructure and the build-out. So it sounds like it maybe wasn't quite as much of a drastic disruption or a drastic difference in cost to build out that AI model than was originally announced.
Yeah, I think I've seen stuff about that as well. But I guess aside from that, what are some other lessons that startups that are looking to develop AIs like DeepSeek, how could they steal some of DeepSeek's approach to, infiltrate this AI section that's going on right now, or this AI, what do we say, like war that's going on?
Yeah. It actually reminds me, and I did a short video on this on TikTok and Instagram Reels and on YouTube Shorts. But one thing that this whole DeepSeek thing reminds me of is one of my favorite business books is called Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. And I think it was written in the 90s, but it's still relevant today. It's about tech companies and how the first mover, the company that first develops a technology is often actually at a disadvantage because they're sort of testing the market and they're getting a product out there that other competitors can watch and learn what the leader did, and they can come in behind and do something better and cheaper and faster and whatever. And I think that's sort of what DeepSeek is doing here. And in through history with technology, you've seen it a million times. I mean, Apple's a great example. Apple, despite common belief, did not invent the whole concept of portable music. I mean, MP3 players were around. There was Napster. There were leaders that were way ahead of Apple in the music front. But what Apple did is they had a product with the iPhone that came out in 2006, and then they added music to it, and they created a better mousetrap based on some of the learnings of what Napster and the MP3 industry was doing at the early stage. So Apple came in and completely dominated it to the point where now you don't even think about Napster. You think of Apple, you think of Spotify, you think of other streaming platforms that totally disrupted. But those guys weren't the first movers. They were the ones that came in and learned from the first movers. And so I think that's sort of what DeepSeek is doing here. And so I don't think it should be that much of a shock to people. And it's a good thing too, I think, because if someone else comes along and does it even better and faster and cheaper than DeepSeek, that's just good for adoption of AI. It's good for pricing. It's good for all sorts of things. So I think there's a lot of benefit to it.
You made some great points there, but I want to switch gears away from DeepSeek, but sticking to AI to our next newsworthy topic. So this UK-based faculty AI is making waves in the education sector by leveraging AI to assist teachers with making homework and lesson planning. The company secured a $3 million contract with UK's Department of Education to develop a content store, which is basically a centralized database of curriculum for students. This initiative aims to streamline teachers' workloads by enabling AI-powered tools for grading, lesson planning, and other administrative tasks. Faculty AI is known for its work with Vote Leave during Brexit, which is now positioned as a key player in shaping AI government policy. Beyond education, the content store concept could expand to other government departments, potentially improving efficiencies in sectors like energy, environment, and public services. With AI increasingly embedded in policy decisions, Eric, what does this mean for the future of education and government efficiency?
That's interesting. It's kind of, in some ways, it's ironic because, I know using AI in an academic setting is highly frowned upon if you're a student. But now on the flip side, the teachers and administration are potentially using AI to help in their jobs. So I find that contrast. I understand the contrast, but I find that interesting. It reminds me of, just as a side note, I don't know if you saw or if you watch South Park, but when they had there's an episode they did about ChatGPT and if you don't know South Park, especially if you're not in the US, South Park is a animated comedy. It's very politically incorrect. It's very funny. But they take on current pop culture, current event type stuff on the show and sort of poke fun at it. And in this episode, it was focused on ChatGPT. And in the show, the kids were these kids are like in second and third grade, I think, on the show, but they all figure out how to use AI to do their homework and to do a bunch of other stuff. And then the teachers find out. Teachers get mad at first, but then the teachers realize, oh, wait, but I could use AI to grade the papers. And so they all start using AI just to grade the papers, and makes their jobs a lot easier. And they're not even like reading the assignments or looking at the homework. And then the principal wants to ban AI once he finds out all the kids are using AI. And then the teachers revolt and say, well, no, we don't want you to ban AI because, they're benefiting from it as well. So I couldn't help but think of that episode of South Park as it relates to that. But, I think realistically speaking, though, I understand why students you wouldn't want to use it because you want them to learn to think for themselves, just like a lot of us when we were kids, we wondered, why did we have to learn how to do long division by hand when we could just use a calculator? It's the same kind of thing. You kind of have to understand the inner workings of things, even if you're not going to realistically do longhand division. I haven't done longhand division since, probably for 40 years or something. But anyway, there's a benefit in learning behind it. But I think it could only help make education better, because if you could consolidate all that knowledge in lessons from other schools and that sort of thing, I think AI can only provide a better educational experience, better curriculum. As you mentioned, there's a lot of benefit that AI could bring to make teachers even smarter than they already are.
Yeah, and this kind of plays into what you just said, kind of plays into my next question of how do you see AI's role evolving in education over the next 5 to 10 years, and could tools like Faculty AI's content store be, a big game changer for teachers worldwide?
It could, yeah, I think it could, and it could also provide a little bit of equalization, between different, demographics of kids. If you're in a private school, super high end private school versus a public school with limited funding, AI has suddenly become sort of an equalizer to where there's not as much of an advantage to going to a big fancy private school versus, a school with lesser resources or whatever. I also think it could provide, more consistency in how kids are trained. You look in the United States, you've got 50 states that each has their own different education systems that do things a bit differently. So if you grow up in the US, at least, if you grow up in one city or state, you might have a totally different educational experience than someone who, is in a neighboring state. So it sort of sort of normalizes or makes a more of a level playing field. And certainly globally as well. I imagine it could. You think about developing countries where they don't invest heavily, or they don't have the resources to invest heavily in education. With AI, maybe they do. Maybe some of these less developed countries can provide better education. So I think overall it just lifts the opportunities for a lot of people throughout the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And with the UK government actively integrating AI into public services, what are the biggest opportunities and risks for startups working with government agencies?
Question. Well, I think the biggest thing is anytime you're working with a government agency, it's going to be complex. It's going to be risky. there's going to be a lot of misalignment. And in fact, we're going to talk a lot about this in our next segment with Aaron Patterson when we talk about the UK government's big digital transformation ERP project. But anytime you're dealing with a government entity, there's just a lot of risk in that implementation because the entity is so big, because it's so typically diverse. Typically, it's very political, understandably so, because it is a government entity. Typically, it's highly resistant to change because you've got a lot of tenured people, and typically they've grown up with highly customized legacy systems. So, just because AI is a great technology doesn't mean it's going to be easy for these startups to provide AI tools to the government. I think it's great they're doing it, but I think there's still a lot of risk, especially as it relates to implementing it and deploying those technologies across those organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And beyond education and what we're talking about here, what other public service sectors do you think are ripe or ready for disruption by AI, and how can startups support these transformations?
Yeah, I mean, I think they all are, in some way. I mean, education you mentioned is a good one because it's knowledge based, and AI plays nicely with a knowledge based sort of environment like that. But you could also look at transactional based, data based sorts of entities. Think of an office or a department that processes permits, for example. That's a very manual, tedious process, but AI could help automate a lot of that and help make people's jobs a little bit less mundane and more effective, with those tools. So I think there's a lot of opportunity throughout any government entity to leverage, different ways of using AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we're going to get out of AI here in this next part with Aaron, but we are going to stay in the EMEA region or UK region with our next conversation. So that will be good to talk about.
Yeah, this is almost like the EMEA episode because everything is so related to Europe, Middle East, and Africa here in this episode. We're going to bring Aaron on the show, who is the executive vice president of the EMEA region here at Third Stage Consulting. And he's going to be on the show with me to talk about a massive government ERP implementation, specifically in the UK. The project is called The Matrix, is what they've named it. It's a big Workday implementation. Workday is going to replace Oracle and Microsoft and some other products that are being used currently throughout the different departments in the UK government. So we're going to talk about that case study, some of the risks, the pitfalls, what to expect, some of the lessons learned that might come from that. And after that, we're going to talk even more about EMEA when we talk about Spar Group, which is a big food retailer in the EMEA region. They just had a massive $100 million SAP implementation failure. So they spent $100 million on SAP and it did not go well. So we're going to talk about a case study related to that and what some of the lessons learned are from that. So be sure to stick around and we'll be right back. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, the podcast that has everything to do with digital transformation. This is the tech-agnostic view of digital strategy, including the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also see past episodes of the show at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So I'm excited for our guest here today, Aaron Patterson, who is the Executive Vice President of the EMEA region, which includes Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Here at Third Stage Consulting, he manages all of our clients and teams in that region, and wanted to have him on the show today to talk about one of the big projects happening in his part of the world, which is the Matrix project, which is the UK government's attempt to replace their legacy systems across the entire UK government with Workday, which is a SaaS solution that they are going to be implementing throughout the entire government organization. So we want to talk about some of the risks and pitfalls and lessons, and really use this as sort of an active case study to apply some lessons to our own transformations and our own ERP implementations. So with all that being said, Aaron, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. This is an exciting topic. I'm really looking forward to diving in.
Yeah, it's always fun to take a real life active project, take a look at it, talk about what some of the complexities and risks are, what are the pitfalls, what are some of the challenges this project team and this organization should expect to see. And chances are pretty high that a lot of what we talk about here today is going to apply to any project. So that's really why we want to do it in sort of a case study format, looking at public information. And just to be clear, this is not a client of ours. We don't work with the UK government on this project. We're basing our discussion here on public information. So we're not revealing anything confidential, and we're certainly making some assumptions around what this project will look like. So just to start, before we dive into the Matrix project itself, and some of the questions I have for you and some of the questions the audience will have, Aaron, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your background and sort of how you grew up in the space and what you do here at Third Stage?
Sure. So my background has really been in implementing large projects around the world. So I've spent a lot of time working on actual implementation. So I have a lot of history around performing system integration as well as consulting implementations. Me and you obviously worked together over 20 years ago, 25 years ago now, I think, on an international project. We ended up in ESCOM in South Africa, working on some consulting for a large upgrade and implementation there. So that's just an example of some of the kind of projects that I've been involved in. Spent some time building companies, kind of from scratch as startups, but then also building them up through private equity investment and kind of making sure they scale appropriately. So I had a lot of experience of actually implementing systems and processes for the companies that I worked for, as well as actually being a consultant. So wide, varied background. Love all this stuff. Love technology, and so getting to chat about one of the big projects is one of the things I really enjoy. So
yeah, you've gotten to see your share of complicated, messy technology projects, including the one you and I worked on many years ago, back when we were just young lads, young and naive back in the day. And now we can take all the stuff we've learned in those 25 years working in the same space and apply it here today. So you manage, just to kind of pick on one point here before I dive into some of the questions, you manage the EMEA region here at Third Stage. Just tell us a little bit about what that looks like, or kind of what that entails.
Yeah, so we have a number of kind of projects and customers in the EMEA region. So we actually have we have two offices, permanent offices, one in the UK, just outside of London, and then we also have one down in Cape Town and in South Africa. We have a lot of customers down there who are very focused on mining, So they're big, interesting projects. And then we also have some work in the Middle East as well. So we do a lot of work there. My role is really to help grow the work that we're doing there and also be responsible for everything that we deliver in the region. So pulling the teams together, making sure that our customers are happy and getting what they need, and providing some executive direction on individual projects as necessary as we kind of move forward.
Got it. Yeah, it's a region we're strategically focused on growing, and it's certainly a relevant topic here, talking about one of the bigger transformations happening in Europe right now. So this will be a fun conversation. Well, let's dive into it then. So just at a real high level, just to give some context, and actually I dropped in the chat here of the session, I dropped a link to an article that sort of gives an overview of this Matrix ERP project. For those that haven't heard of it, we'll certainly talk about it. But if you want to read about it, I dropped a link to that article in the chat wherever you're watching here. But the general gist of this project is that the UK government, which includes several different entities or agencies, including the Cabinet Office, Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, Department for Energy, several different departments, plus 20 different arm's length bodies, are all migrating to Workday, essentially. And they're moving from a hodgepodge of different systems, including Oracle and Microsoft and other technologies that we'll dive in here today. And this is a pretty big deal. It's a £144.3 million project. Which is roughly the same in US dollars, roughly around 150 million in US dollars for those that aren't familiar with the exchange rates. But it's a 10-year project, could go up to 12 years, 48,000 users, a lot of different diverse agencies that are part of this. What do you see, Aaron, is sort of what are the complexities, when you look at this project and just sort of the information we do have about it? What are some of the things you would expect to be super complicated or risky in a project like this?
Yeah, I think, one of the key things, you mentioned a bunch of different departments there. There isn't really a common kind of synergy between the different departments that are involved, right? They already have a lot of existing systems in place and different processes. When you look at, the Treasury and the Attorney General's office, how overlapping do you think those processes will actually be? Maybe right. Managing the budget side of things is comparable across the different organizations, but they're coming back from a large disparate number of systems and processes, and really the goal of the project, as it was publicly stated, was to converge the data, the policies, and the processes across these departments. Now, what that means is that hasn't happened yet, right? And I think even as they were building the team around who was going to be part of this particular project, because this is part of a much greater overall government initiative where they have essentially broken all the different departments into different groups. So the Matrix organization is one, another one is Synergy, where there's 4 or 5 kind of government entities brought together. And so pulling all of this together within that environment, I think, is going to be incredibly complicated. Even the spending watchdog, I think back in January 2023, Alex Chisholm, he said the Matrix bundle was the trickiest one of the 5. I don't think they had even agreed which departments were going to be part of this process until they had actually started negotiating the contracts themselves. So I think that's going to be an interesting process, I think, as they work to define what the goals of the project are and keep all of those different organizations in sync, And then you get into some of the more, I think one of the key things is really stakeholder misalignment. I think that's probably going to be a big risk, right? Is everybody on the same page? They've kind of pulled all these different departments together and given them a common goal, but has everybody actually bought into that process and that project? Has there been some that have kind of been dragged along and you have to do this? And is there going to be a lot of issues around that? And then that, we haven't even talked about some of the technical side of that, right? If we have 15 different instances of systems in place and they're on different technologies, they'll have different data models, they'll have different processes. I would imagine each organization has a different governance structure around how those previous implementations are managed. So if you take something, I wouldn't say relatively simple, but simple in concept of we have to migrate legacy data into the new system. So all of a sudden, we're not talking about one project. We're essentially talking about at least 15, assuming that the target model is consistent. We're going to do 15 data migrations in parallel, or at least in a kind of coordinated timescale to be able to do that and end up in a system that will meet the requirements of all those different organizations. I think it's just there's a lot to bite off as far as this goes. And then, I would say even just the vendor and contractual risks. I think, there's a lot of work gone on to select Workday. They were obviously the winner. It was a competitive bid. I think Oracle and Microsoft were in the final list as well. So hopefully on the vendor side, they're very comfortable with the vendor themselves. They've obviously worked together, have a good relationship with them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have won this. But then weaving that back in to the SI side of this, right? The actual project, and Cognizant were the selected SI to put these systems in. So being able to manage that over, I think the SI project was an initial 5-year period. So managing an SI to be able to coordinate between all these disparate departments and pull that all together into a system that everybody will accept, that all of the users, you mentioned 48,000 users. You have to get 48,000 users to be successfully using this system, right? At the end, or at least a very large percentage of those to consider this project a success. If you just think about getting 48,000 people to do anything,
right.
It's not the easiest thing. Even if you're giving free donuts away or something, getting 48,000 people to line up and wait in line for free food, getting them to use a brand new system that maybe isn't their first choice. Maybe they've spent a lot of time being the expert on the legacy system. There's a lot of different things that has to be done to make sure that an implementation is successful with that huge number of users.
Yeah, and that's true even if these were all just one agency or one government
Absolutely.
arm within the UK, even if all 48,000 were in that same division or arm, that's a big undertaking. Now you're not talking about one government agency, though. You're talking about dozens. And that, like you said, you had a really good point. They all do different things. They have different needs. They have different technologies that they already have in place. And now you're trying to move them all onto one platform. And it's not just one platform. It's a SaaS platform with Workday, right. Which is a lot less flexible, for better or for worse, than some of these on-prem legacy systems that they were using. So that's a whole nother risk or can of worms you've got to navigate, is just, how do you move from these highly tailored systems that are in each different part of the government? How do you move all those people, all those processes onto one platform that doesn't give you a ton of flexibility, in the way you had it before? So that's a whole nother, change management risk, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we always talk about people being the make or break in these projects, whether they're small or large, right? If you don't have the users on board, if you don't have the necessary training in place, if you've underestimated kind of the testing that needs to be done, these all cause issues on any size project, right? And once you get into the large ones, the level of communication, the speed of decision making, there's a lot of different things that need to happen in parallel in a coordinated fashion to end up with a successful project. And then you throw in the fact, really, this is a government organization, right? There are rules and regulations around what they can and can't do, the strict security and data privacy. It's just layer upon layer of kind of what is going to ultimately be a very very complicated project. It'll probably be a lot of fun to work on, but yeah, there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration to try and get to a successful endpoint.
Yeah. Now you talked about some of what makes this complex, which inherently sort of bleeds over into what some of the risks are. So I think we've talked about complexity and the fact that we're taking disparate systems and processes and people into one SaaS-based solution. Are there any other risks you see that one could expect on a project like this?
Yeah, I think so. I think outside of the change resistance, I think stakeholder misalignment is probably going to be one of the key ones. I know we touched on that earlier, but what is the governance structure? Who is authorized to make decisions? How quickly can they be made? This is an ongoing project. You kind of sit around and take 3 months to make critical decisions while everybody else just sits and twiddles their thumbs. There's going to have to be momentum in this project in order to hit the timelines that are expected. What is the governance structure? What happens when you have conflicting requirements between two different agencies? What is the process for resolving that? Do you have to come to agreement and you're essentially pitching one agency against another or one office against another? Or is that going to result in scope creep, or you're going to have additional customization and configuration that wasn't originally planned because you don't have the one nice happy path to be able to get stuff done? I think some of the legacy systems and the integrations that have to happen, I don't think we've really talked about that. I think the integration and interoperability, because they're coming from so many disparate systems, how are the connections around those systems? Just because you're changing the ERP, it's very rare for an ERP to sit on its own in kind of an island, right? It's a lot more expected that it relates into other systems that are being used by the organization. And if those other systems are different across all of the offices that are going forward with this project, then that essentially multiplies the number of integrations that had to happen within a standard ERP. So I think that's definitely going to be one. I think obviously one of the big risks of programs like this are really budget and timeline overruns. I think it's incredibly complex in general to predict how long a project is going to be. And, we sit on the sidelines. In my previous life, I've estimated very large implementation projects because my organizations used to bid on those. And it's incredibly complex to get estimates right for a program that is this large. You have to make assumptions. And are those assumptions true, or are they assumptions that are true in your head in order to make the price more competitive? I'm sure that, in a competitive situation, you're not given a whiteboard to the organization to essentially come up with the best ultimate decision. It's the best ultimate decision within a pricing framework or within a cost boundary. And so that necessitates some compromises. And are those compromises clear? And are they agreed on as part of the contractual negotiations? And is everybody starting this project on the same page? Do they have true alignment between the steering committee, between the vendors, and between the contract, so that they can push forward and everybody is on the same page? It's very rare that you can get all of those things aligned, even on some of the smaller projects that we deal with, right? I mean, and so once you add in this level of complexity and change coming from all of the different systems, it gets incredibly complicated. It's just a hard thing to do. And a lot of times you don't know the real details until you get into some of those more detailed workshops, right? Until you start mapping out some of those business processes. I don't believe looking at the scope of work that was put out to bid, I don't believe there was a comprehensive kind of phase zero done at the start of this project before they got into contract negotiations. And so, that would have highlighted a lot of areas of risk and areas that need to be concentrated. When that hasn't happened before you get to the start of this project, you're going to spend a lot of the first couple of months really making sure that you do have alignment, making sure that everybody is doing the right thing, making sure they are on the same page, and making appropriate plans to be able to address any outstanding risks that you have if there are differences between expectations and the contract and how you're actually going to put your project plan together.
Yeah. I mean, you hit so many good points there. I mean, they're so important to any project, but especially a project like this. I mean, first of all, you talked about the first thing you were talking about just now is sort of the stakeholder alignment and some of the challenges there. I would love to see what their steering committee looks like. When you've got a steering committee typically where you escalate decisions, right? We've got to make a decision on a standard process, or we've got to make a decision on potential increase in scope. Who would make that decision in a project like this? I mean, I have no idea how you would, with say 36 different agencies involved, you could have one person representing each agency and a steering committee of 36 people or whatever it is. That just seems cumbersome. But
and are they willing to give up control, right? I mean, I think everybody will want a voice on that steering committee, which is probably necessary, but then it will lead to a lack of crisp and speedy decision making, right? I mean, I'm just thinking through how some of those meetings would be a very formal kind of government process and documentation, and obviously working in politics. I mean, that's a lot of what they do, right? The civil service integrating with the actual political figures, and the length of this project actually lasts longer than the parliament will sit. So there'll be a change in the parliament probably during the course of this project itself, which may result in some change in directions. I think there's going to be it's going to be very interesting to see, like you said, how the governance of this project at the very high level will be managed appropriately.
Yeah. I mean, that alone, I think, is a nightmare. Just trying to figure out how to get all those diverse stakeholders on the same page, because you're right. It's political, and every organization is political, but at least in the private sector, you're all sort of marching toward the same.
Let's make the company better. Let's make the company more efficient. Let's make some money. Now, but you're right. The goals of each of those organizations are very different, right? I mean, one of them is the UK Department of Space. That's one of the arm's length bodies. What has that got to do with HM Treasury? Are they aligned in what their goals are? Probably no. Treasury wants to control the money, and the UK space team wants to go off into the stars. Those two things aren't necessarily, in alignment at the top level. Now, making the country better and being a better organization for its citizens, I'm sure you can, align at some very high level strategy around that. But whether that filters down into meaningful action on behalf of, the owners of these implementations, that's a good question.
Yeah. It's a great point. And then you also talked about phase zero and how important it is to, well, first of all, you made the assumption, which I agree with, just based on what we've read about this case, that they probably did not do a thorough phase zero, which in my opinion would take, I would say, at least a year, probably longer. If you didn't spend like a year, let's just say minimum, where you look at all the general high level processes and needs across these different agencies, laying out the blueprint for what are those differences between the agencies and where are the commonalities, and really understanding like where the risks and the pitfalls are going to be. You don't really know. If you haven't done that, you're sort of guessing that this is a 10-year project. And it almost, when I hear 10 years, to me, it's like, that sounds like a nice round number that someone said, let's call it 10 years. We'll take about a decade to do this. And in theory, you think, well, 10 years. I mean, surely we can get it done in 10 years, but it's amazing how fast time goes when you're spinning your wheels.
And I think the 10-year number, right, I think was the software license contract, and they were actually trying to do everything within 5 to 7, right? That was the 5 plus 2. So the SI contract in its initial form is really 5. So they're going to try and get it done in that time frame. Now, but you bring up a lot of good points here. It's like, are they going to spend the first part of their services project kind of validating what they made assumptions on? Now, I would assume, given the length of time that this contracting process went on, I would imagine, especially some of the large experienced organizations that were involved in that process, have done some of the work that would typically be done in a phase zero, just so that they could appropriately manage their risk, right? I mean, I'm assuming Cognizant have done their due diligence and have a lot of a lot of effort around what actually exists and what they're doing. But one of the things I noticed when I was reading up on this was some of the agencies kind of jumped on late in the game. They went part of the original team as the contract went out. So even the member organizations that are part of the Matrix project changed throughout the contracting process until we ended up with the final one. Now, if you weren't part of it at the start, I can't imagine there was much due diligence done about existing processes and systems and things to be able to be incorporated in the overall plan. But I think, I think that's what makes these projects interesting, right? It's impossible to manage every single risk. And so you have to really, really focus on some of the big ones. But I think, getting back to the original point, you really have to have aligned stakeholders. One way or another, you have to ensure that everybody is moving in the right direction at the top, because this project will not be easy. And if you don't have that, you're going to struggle to make the right decisions at the right time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting for sure. And the other thing too, and this is pure speculation. I may be wrong on this as it relates to the specific of this case. I have not seen the contracts, between Cognizant and the UK government, but I would suspect that, to your point, a large, sophisticated organization like Cognizant is going to manage their risk because they have to. And the last person you want suing you, or the last organization you want suing you, is probably going to be the UK government or any government entity. So you're going to manage your risk. You're going to put in assumptions and clauses that say things like you're going to use Workday as it's built off the shelf. You're not going to customize. You're going to make decisions within X amount of time. You're going to, it's sort of managing Cognizant's risk. So the assumptions are clear, but that is likely going to put the risk on the customer, on the government. They're going to have to now do, and a lot of times organizations don't fully realize what they're getting into. There's these little bullet points in a statement of work or a master service agreement, but those little bullet points can be like paper cuts. They just sort of add up and put all this risk on you that you're not prepared to deal with. So that would be really interesting to look at all these contracts and see sort of what transpired there. Yeah.
Even just, simple things like limits on the number of integrations that they're going to do to the core system, right? I mean, what happens if one of these new organizations that jumped on at the last has 3 or 4 additional integrations? Then, that'll be a change request. There's no way of getting around that.
I'm here with Aaron Patterson. We're talking about the UK's massive Matrix ERP implementation. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. I've included a link to a video right here that describes Third Stage in a bit more detail. It talks about our story, our history, our philosophy, our clients, our service offerings, and that sort of thing. But in general, what Third Stage Consulting does is we're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting provider. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, a ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 208. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Aaron Patterson. We're talking about the big ERP implementation happening in the UK government right now. I'm going to pull a question in here from Darian on LinkedIn. We could spend the entire session talking about this one question, but maybe we can we'll try to summarize it here. But this is from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian says, with 48,000 users needing to transition to a new system, what strategy should be prioritized to ensure widespread adoption and minimize resistance? And could you solve world hunger while you're at it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things that need to be done, right? I mean, I think you really have to have a plan. You have to really focus on what you do and be very specific about what the issues are. So making sure that you understand what those issues are before you get going. I mean, they've been using a legacy system for data and will resist, users will resist change. I mean, that's just what happens. And so, ensuring you have stakeholder engagement right the way throughout the organization is a key one. You've really got to try hard to prevent productivity loss and operational disruption, making people's work harder, even just at the start as that system goes in, and that can generate a lot of pushback from users. You want to try and get away from that. Really align the leadership and the actual departments so that they're in sync, so everybody understands, so management understands what is actually happening, what changes have to be made, and so they have a level of empathy with the end users, right? I mean, you don't want to force something down, especially with that level of users, and really, you've got to do what you can to encourage a culture of continuous improvement, I think, as well. You want to give the opportunity to keep improving things. This isn't a one and done thing. You're not going to have the magic right answer, right? Even after implementation go live, I think you have to ensure that the end users feel like they have a voice, that they can continually make suggestions and improvements. And I think that helps a lot of times with buy-in as well.
Right. Yeah, very true. And, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about so far too, like when you've talked about stakeholder alignment, phase 0, certainly change management. A lot of these things are, what's the word I'm looking for? They're prerequisites, or they're things that enable better user adoption. So if you get everyone on the same page, that's going to pave the way for user adoption. It doesn't solve it all, but at least gives you a pathway to say, okay, we at least have alignment. Now we can go focus on training, communications, and things of that nature. But what ends up happening a lot of times here is you're not aligned, you're not on the same page. The SI is off doing their thing, building technology. And then when it comes time to train people, they start freaking out because they see like how different this is than the world they're used to. And that's where the user resistance kicks in. And usually that's toward the end of the project, or the project, the end of the project on paper, I should say, because now you've opened up a can of worms that
now the next project starts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, you have to get the foundation right? I mean, I think, foundational baseline of what the project would do. I think one of the things we always recommend is change management starts. If it hasn't started already, it starts now, right? It has to be as early as possible in the process. Otherwise, you do end up getting to the end and the users just don't understand or like or want to use the system. But then making sure, you don't go forward with one size fits all training, right? I mean, you have to have a customized training plan based on user roles and responsibilities. And I think spending enough time defining what that training plan looks like and how you are actually going to implement it. Just the pure logistics of training 48,000 people.
Yeah.
You know, when do you schedule workshops? What happens if somebody misses? What happens if you need some follow-up training because a trainer was sick one day? You know, you have to have enough buffer in place. There's a lot of basic things just to implement the project itself without addressing some of the more, the less concrete risks that you're going to face in an implementation like this.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I had to speculate, or if I were a betting person, which I'm not, I hate betting, but if I did bet, I would bet on this absolutely taking longer than 5 to 7 years, just based on everything we've talked about so far. And we haven't even really started to scratch the surface of some of the complexities, I think.
Yeah.
One thing I want to mention too, I forgot to mention this before when you were talking about phase zero, is we have a phase zero checklist, and I'm going to pop up a QR code right here on the screen for those of you that are watching this podcast. If you scan that QR code, you can actually download or view on our website the phase zero checklist. So it sort of gives you an idea of what Aaron and I are talking about when we say phase zero, and did Cognizant and did the UK government, did they spend enough time on phase zero to make sure that they have a realistic plan and a realistic strategy to address a lot of the stuff we're talking about here today. So this is a really helpful checklist. It's a real easy read, but it's something you can use and apply to your organizations if you want to check that out. I've also dropped it in the chat of the streams here as we're going. But I want to come to another audience question here that we just got a bunch in a row. So I'm trying to find the one I was looking for. This is a really interesting question that, again, we could spend the whole session on this one question, but this is from Fahim on LinkedIn. Fahim says, how would you be able to lock the requirements from a multitude of stakeholders? And what is your strategy to visualize the future state early on and get every stakeholder to agree upon it? So I guess maybe to paraphrase a little bit, or maybe summarize the question, when you look at future state, how do you get 48,000 people all on the same page with what that future state's going to be, or do you?
That is the $1 million question, I think, right? I mean, there are definitely things that you can put in place. I think one of the interesting decisions will be how they run the workshops and how much customization and configuration is expected, is allowed, and has been agreed upon up front. Because if there is some flexibility in process, given the different organizations that they're running, maybe it's, an iterative process as they pick one agency and move to the next and move to the next. If they're truly going with, we are going out of the box and we're doing minimal configuration only, then those workshops and decisions are a lot different, because you go in and say, this is the answer. How well can we map your existing processes and what might be missing or what needs to be changed? Mm-hmm. And I think, there's practical things around using technology to capture requirements, being able to share them, having clear sign-off protocols between the different groups, who's responsible for acceptance, making sure that you keep, requirements traceability matrix so that you understand what the requirements are. But it gets back to really the project control mechanisms. Who's got the role and accountability for agreeing to requirements? Mm-hmm. How far up or down is that in each of the different organizations involved, or the different departments, and what is expected in terms of speed of decision making, compromise, and ultimately what the end solution will be.
Right. Yeah. Great point. And here's a follow-up that I'll pull up here from this is from Prashant on LinkedIn. Prashant says, I feel that ultimately all of these different offices would have one goal, and that is to service the citizens and residents. And this is similar to what you said earlier, Aaron. Yeah. And then he goes on to say, maybe driving the design from their perspective will help in integrating the experience across different agencies, and may even help purge some of the redundancies. So, I think this is a great point, but I think the question is I totally agree with this comment. I don't know what you think, Aaron. I think this is a great comment, but I think it's a lot easier said than done. Like we can sit here and say, like, hey, all 48,000 users, let's all get on the same page that we are here to provide a better experience, a better life for UK residents. you could probably get some pretty strong consensus on that. But the problem is once you start to dive down into my little area and my job and my goal as, you know, my part of the organization, it's going to be really hard to change. It's going to be really hard to change me because I've got such a narrow focus, you know, being part of one specific agency within a broader entity like that.
Absolutely. And I mean, even if you look at something that should be standard across a government, right? Like budget allocation procedures and budget reporting, like how are you doing against that? Are those actually standard in those different departments now, given that you have, you know, the high level organizations and then the arm's length bodies as well? I'm not sure that managing their budgets are consistent between all those different groups. And so has there been agreement that that's going to happen? What happens if there's certain reports that are done now that feed certain processes that are specific to that one organization that aren't really necessary for another 2 or 3 of the major groups that are part of this project? Is there a mechanism to allow differences in how the data is used? And then you take a step back even further and go, okay, well, if you have different reports, does that mean I need different data? And then is that a different data model? Is that a supplemental data model to support some specific customization or configuration for one group? Is that allowed in this project? Or is everybody just, we're all going the same and that really is it? And the real issue isn't the technical implementation. The real issue is making sure that the organizations can still function in the new world, and you can get enough momentum with the end users and the staff who are going to use this system to be able to implement it successfully. You know, because having a very structured implementation is going to cause a lot more issues on the change management side. But if you have a very flexible implementation, that'll help you manage the risk on the change management side to a certain extent. But then you get into some of the technical complexities and the scope creep, and then also the technical debt that you might end up with, right? I mean, if you're doing a bunch of configuration and customization, what happens the next time you have to do an upgrade, right? Has that turned into another $50 million project because you've got to go through and modify all the previous customizations and configurations that you've put in place?
Yeah, great point. Here's another comment that I'd love to get your take on here, Aaron. This is from Amy on LinkedIn. Amy says, given the length of the project, typical phase 0 could be redundant by the time the findings become relevant. And I assume she means the findings from phase 0. And that's where you sort of, phase 0 is typically where you sort of dive into fully understand what the real lay of the land is. You get alignment, you create that future state blueprint, et cetera, et cetera. She goes on to say, one would hope that the principles and desired outcomes have been explored in advance and some element of cohesion and agreement across the different groups. It's a nice hope. It's a nice wish.
Yes.
The question is, the question is going to be,
hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, great. I was trying to remember that. What is that saying about strategy and hope? And you nailed it. So what do you think? I mean, what are your thoughts on this comment?
You know what's interesting is in this particular instance, I think the fact that it is a government agency may help, right? Because the rate of change in any government agency around the world, right? It's not UK specific. I know.
It's a good point.
Maybe it's outside of the US over the last 4 or 5 days when it appears Elon Musk is breaking things at a rapid rate.
Right.
I think that's probably a different scenario. But in general, governments do not move very fast. And so I think this is one of the few times where dealing with government agencies where you're setting strategy and goals, the timeline would probably still be relevant, even if it did take 6 months to a year. I think if you're in a fast-moving business, I mean, some of the projects that we're doing now around AI strategy with some of our customers, the rate of change in that world makes it very difficult to have concrete strategies in place that are relevant 2 or 3 years down the line, right? I mean, even looking forward, things can get thrown off course, right? I mean, if you look at the DeepSeek information that came out a couple of weeks ago, that totally threw out a lot of work that was being done, or at least a lot of a lot of expectation around the amount of compute power, right? And so business and technology can move very, very quickly in the non-government world. Now, hopefully the government is getting more agile with this technology move and being able to address things quicker. But I do think the fact that it is a government agency would allow you a little bit more leeway in the time that a phase zero would be relevant in terms of implementation.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, but let's just say they were a private sector organization, same size, same scope, and let's just assume you could have that same level of complexity in the private sector. Amy's point would be probably a lot more relevant there too, in that the business is changing. They're entering new markets, they're making acquisitions, and especially when you look at the course of 5 to 7 years, I mean, so much can change just in the private sector in that amount of time that, yeah, you want to do a phase zero, but you also have to be prepared to pivot and introduce some agile concepts that allow you to get the best of both worlds. The phase zero being more, maybe a little more waterfall-esque, in terms of getting requirements and needs and a clear plan up front, but also being able to pivot and adjust and recognizing when the time is right to do so.
Yeah. And I think, when we do large implementations like this and are involved, I think one of the key things that you want to do is make sure that you have phases throughout the project, right? And you have the opportunity for feedback loops. So you do take advantage of the lessons learned. So if you are doing an implementation like this, it's not going to be big bang, right? You're not going to flick the switch for 48,000 people. You're going to concentrate, and a lot of our customers, we will go either function by function, or we will go country by country, or a combination of those two, depending on what they need. And so I think it's imperative in building out the overall program and the project plan that there is enough space between implementation phases as you're rolling this out to get the lessons learned, to allow for improvements. If you do have to go through and do a little mini refresh of the phase zero as it relates to the future pieces of work, I think that's a valuable exercise, and making sure that, the worst case scenario is you have 8 implementation phases. Phase 1, maybe doesn't go quite as smoothly, but you pay no attention to what actually didn't go smoothly and you don't fix it, and you just keep repeating those problems. By the time you get to the 8th or 9th implementation, it'll be a lot worse. And so what you want to do is make sure you learn from each implementation and you get better, and you have those formal feedback loops at the end of each phase that involves actually, interviewing the users, how it was actually working for them, what issues they had, whether they would suggest additional training up front, additional post-go live support. There's a lot of different things that you can do to improve over time. And so I think, just making sure that you're proactive about learning what's working and what's not on these long-term programs, and being committed both as vendors and customers in partnership, being committed to take those lessons learned on board and being able to modify the future plans to take advantage of the best practices that you're learning while you're doing it.
Yeah, it's great advice. Here's a question that is from Darian on LinkedIn, and Darian is our co-host on this podcast, obviously, and I think she's intentionally trying to trigger us, Aaron. So we're going to take this question because I think she knows what she's doing.
I'll take a deep breath.
Yeah. She says, how should change requests be handled to avoid excessive cost overruns and project delays?
Okay. I think it's going to be complicated, but there has to be a formal decision process laid out at the start of the project. What actually happens? What level of decision requires different governance bodies? You're obviously going to have an implementation project team. You're going to have the executive steering committee. Have a framework for what level of decision and impact gets dealt with at different areas. Be clear about who has responsibility to make decisions, and be clear about expected timeframes for those decisions to be made. You don't want the executive steering committee making individual requirement kind of, yes, that's in, that's out, right? I mean, that has to be much lower down with the project team, the implementation team, the end users who will ultimately go with the system. But some of the bigger things like, oh, we have found a new system that all of a sudden we have to do integration to that wasn't in scope, that's going to add 3 months to the project and an extra £5 million. That would be something that has to go to the steering committee, I would imagine. But being clear about what that decision framework is, what the rules of engagement are, how things are progressed up and down the chain, and how timely those decisions are expected, so that things don't get stuck in committee and the project grinds to a halt.
Yeah. That makes sense. You make it sound so easy.
It's easy when we're just talking about it like this, right? I mean, we've both been in projects where we know all the right answers, but actually getting the customer to the point of doing those right answers and making sure that they have a good project. It's a very different thing with boots on the ground. I know a project. It was a pretty large project in the southeast of the US that I worked on with one of my good friends, Adam Tonkin, and we used to have this phrase. And we'd go into workshops and we would literally say to the steering committee, we will drag you kicking and screaming to success on this project, because they were so reticent to make decisions that, nobody wanted to be wrong, but not making decisions was wrong, right? That would cause more negative impacts than a yes or a no. Sometimes decisions don't necessarily have to, you don't have to spend weeks doing research and coming up with the right answer. Sometimes a project team just needs an answer to move forward and get to the next problem. And understanding the difference between those two, I think, is a key part of making projects successful.
Yeah.
And helping customers and, helping the organizations. This may be, especially when you're dealing with government, I'm just thinking, they're probably not used to having authority to make very quick decisions. And if that's really the case, but that is what's required to make a successful project, that has to be addressed pretty early, right? You have to encourage people to feel confident, to understand that people do have their back. Everybody's on the same page. This project has to be successful for the organization, and nobody's going to go on a witch hunt at the end because somebody said A instead of B. It's everybody's in it together, and we are going to drive this project forward to ultimate success.
Right. Yeah, it's a great point. And there's a professor in Europe, I believe he's in Netherlands. His name's Hans Mulder, and he I think he's at the he must be in Belgium, because I think he teaches at the University of Antwerp. So he's studied. His name's Hans Mulder, and he has a database of over 100,000 ERP case studies over the last 30 years. And in that database, he sort of tracks what some of the challenges were. And, he gets the information from public record, his own research, et cetera, et cetera. But he found, and this is one of the biggest findings I've had probably in the last 10 years. This is one of the biggest aha moments, is when I met with him last time, or one of the last times I was in Europe. I did a podcast interview with him. He was on this podcast, actually. And he talked about, in his research, quantitatively, he shows that the number one cause of implementation budget overruns and time overruns is what he calls decision latency. So in other words, the organization can't make decisions fast enough. And that is the biggest cause of what causes the project to take longer, cost more. So, you can blame the system integrator all you want. You can blame the technology all you want. But a lot of times, majority of the time, it's the organization itself just can't make decisions fast enough. So to your point, even if you're making an imperfect decision, if you make it fast, you don't want to be reckless, of course. You want to get alignment. You want to get as close as you can to the right decision, but it's easy to get stuck in analysis paralysis, because every decision has risks and trade-offs, and every decision is imperfect. And so I think that's where organizations get stuck. I think they kind of know a lot of the times what the right answer is or what the best answer is, but they don't want to make it because it's not a perfect answer.
It comes down to an individual who's very risk averse, right? I mean, it can come down to individual personalities, and especially if they've had a role previously, where they didn't have to make decisions. This is a different experience for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Eric on LinkedIn can proudly confirm he's Dutch, and I feel bad. I know I should know better than to confuse Belgium and Netherlands and any diverse country like that. But I apologize for that to all my friends in Belgium and Netherlands. Here's another comment that I'll share here. This is from Anders on LinkedIn. Anders says, without a formal process for change requests, the client feels like every new idea is free. After all, it costs nothing to ask, but the project should always consider the costs, even if hidden, with either dollars or time. And I think that's a great point. I think a lot of times, especially frontline client people, people that are on the front lines, they don't realize that by asking for this one feature or asking to replicate this one workflow that they had in their old legacy system, that adds a lot of time, cost, money, risk to the project, and someone's got to manage that and make sure there's a clear decision making, governance that you talked about earlier in place.
And I think having multiple change control boards at different levels is probably one of the key things that we would typically see implemented within projects, right? So that there is a formal process to deal with change requests, and sometimes that's at a very low level in terms of data models. Sometimes it's individual functionality or how a screen looks or what a button does, and then other times it's at a much higher level. Like we're talking about, I would imagine once they get into the project, just the phrase 20 arm's length agencies.
Yeah.
They just kind of tack that on the end.
Right.
I could see that being as big as the original project they estimated if that isn't managed appropriately. And so that level of, change request of what are they actually going to do? Are they actually part of the program or not? That may end up at the top level, kind of executive steering committee change request level. So getting the decisions made at the right level within the right time frame is definitely one of the key things.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we shift gears and look at, other high profile ERP failures, and there's a lot to choose from, over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been Hershey's and Waste Management. More recently, there's, Spar Group in South Africa, or the Spar Group, the South African division had a problem with their implementation. A lot of options to choose from, but what lessons could we learn from other high profile failures that might apply here, that we could sort of be prescriptive and say, hey, if you're on the Matrix ERP project, here are some things to keep in mind that we've seen in other failures?
I think, if we stick to some of the government kind of agencies in the past, some of the big failures that we've seen in different governments, I think back in the UK, the NHS had a large £10 billion write-off as they tried to implement a nationwide system, and they really underestimated the data complexity, right? I mean, data migration and quality issues can cause major delays. Whenever you ask anybody, and I've had this so many times, you ask a data owner how their data is, it is perfect until you find out it isn't. And so getting to the bottom of what data exists, how good it actually is, how current is it, how well populated is it, who owns the actual master source data, a lot of these things kind of can impact. So underestimating data quality can really be one of those things that creeps up on the project team. It's never front and center when you're doing the fancy presentations to win an ERP implementation project. It's not like the dirty work of assuring the data is correct is really front and center as part of that process, but it really can be critical. And then just getting back, I think the other one, picking something on this side, on the US side of the Atlantic as well, really, the Air Force had a combat support system, and that was $1 billion failure. I mean, that was huge. Lots of different issues, but this ties back to a lot of the conversation we've had, and it was really around having clear governance and decision-making processes in place. Who has decision-making authority? Who's allowed to make what decision when? And when does it have to get kicked up the chain? And, they went 7 years into that project and canceled it and didn't really have a usable system at the end of it. It was $1 billion. And that is worst case scenario for everybody. And so, it gets back to some of the things we talked about earlier. Really focus on the governance side of the project. Make sure everybody understands what decisions are expected and authorized at different levels, what the process is for moving those up the chains as necessary. And then that will help everybody be on the same page and hopefully get to the decisions being made in the time that is appropriate for the project.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Amy says, as a follow-up here, data quality and complexity, analytics of historical data, complexity of workforce management, lack of unification of T's and C's, all major issue creators. And those are just a few. She's just given us a sampling of what some of those issues might be. So a couple different directions. I know we're short on time here, but if you were to advise the leadership team on this project, let's just say let's just say they're all listening right now, which I don't think they are, but maybe they are. Who knows? If they are, I hope we're not scaring them too much. And actually, before I ask you this question, hold on one second on that, Darren. I want to ask the audience, just based on everything we've talked about so far, I want to do a quick informal poll in the chat here. Just drop a yes or no or maybe with an answer here. I know it's unfair to force you into a box like this to answer it, but yes, no, maybe. Do you think this project is going to be successful? Just based on what we've talked about so far. It could be maybe, it could be yes, but whatever, however you want to answer that, but sort of give me a sort of a knee-jerk reaction here, and based on what you're hearing so far. Or if you think we're off base and you think we're over analyzing, overthinking this, love to hear that too. So drop that in the chat, and if you don't mind, we'll come back to that to see how the audience answers. But back to you, Aaron. What if you could give advice to the leadership team on just one thing that they should do to give themselves the best chance to succeed on this project? What would that be?
I think the one thing is the strong governance with clear accountability. I think that impacts every single thing that gets done in the rest of the project. And if you get that right, you've got a good shot at making sure you're successful.
Right. It's great advice. And the audience is quiet. They're not answering the question, probably because they don't want to. They don't want to answer the question. Is this project going to be successful? Yes, no, maybe. Amy says maybe. Okay. Thank you, Amy, for giving an answer. And that's probably where I'd be. I'd be somewhere between maybe and probably not.
Yeah. I think, these projects, they're not easy, right? I mean, there isn't going to be a given. If you get the right team and the right customer buy-in, you get the buy-in from the organizations, they have every chance of being successful. But a lot of things have to be done in order to make sure they are. And having a top quality team to implement it, having a customer who's willing to compromise, there's a lot of moving parts, and a lot of things have to be managed appropriately to be successful.
Yeah. Getting lots of maybes here. Prashant on LinkedIn says maybe. Vast CNC on YouTube says this is consulting. Everything is a maybe, or it depends. He stole, he or she, I'm not sure. Vast CNC stole my line. I love saying that. It depends. Depends on what they do, right? And that is kind of I think the key here in something that it sort of builds on what you just said, Aaron, is that any project can succeed and any project can fail. It's not just a foregone conclusion, even though I'm sort of asking the audience to assume it's a foregone conclusion. I think the maybe is probably the most realistic answer here, realistically speaking, because it does depend on what they do. How are they going to manage all the stuff you talk about with alignment and get everyone on the same page and getting user adoption and whatnot. This is an interesting point too, which I really like, and it's worth noting. This is from Prashant on LinkedIn. Prashant says it also depends on the definition of what success means. What is a successful project? If finishing on time and on budget isn't a huge deal, and it's just sort of a loose time frame, and it takes, say, 10 years instead of 5 years for them to do this project, but they get what they wanted out of it, that might be okay. It might be a success for them. It does depend. I mean, you have to define clearly what success means, and I think that's a really good point that we haven't really touched on, is just having clear objectives for the project itself, and as well as what you want the outcome of the project to be. So great points there. So a lot of maybes. And Amy says, she said maybe because she knows some of the people that won the deal. So maybe she has the inside track here. Maybe Amy can get us access to someone who's on the project. We could do like a follow-up to see, okay, how are things going? Tell us the truth. We won't tell anyone and get some feedback there. But well, thank you for the feedback there. It looks like the unanimous, or not unanimous, but the majority of you think that maybe this will be successful. And I think that's probably a good way to look at it. All right. So this has been great. I appreciate you taking the time here, and this has been a really good discussion. This might be the fastest live interview we've ever done. As far as I feel like we just started 5 minutes ago, and it's already over an hour.
We could probably go for another 3 or 4 hours on this topic, right?
Thank you, Aaron. Great conversation, and thank you to the audience for the great questions as well. Those are some really engaging things to talk about that I hadn't thought about asking or bringing up, so I really appreciate the audience's questions there. Be sure to check out that Phase Zero checklist as well. You can find that in the links below, or you can scan the QR code if you just rewind. I've got a lot more to cover. We're going to debrief on this conversation with Aaron, and then we're also going to get to the Spar Group SAP debacle. It was a $100 million project. It failed, didn't go well. We're going to talk about that as a case study, talk about what some of the takeaways and lessons learned are. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you'll want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 208. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And the show is produced by Major Tom Productions and sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world, including Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, with their digital transformation initiatives. And we just had our European counterpart, Aaron Patterson, on the show, who manages our EMEA region here at Third Stage, Darian, and great conversation about the Matrix ERP project. What were some of your takeaways from that interview with Aaron?
Yeah, it was a super great conversation. One thing I really liked was the discussion about whether agencies should be allowed flexibility in customization or forced to standardize. I thought that was really interesting. And I liked the point about how too much customization could also lead to long-term technical debt and costly upgrades, which I think could be really important during this project. But Eric, for you, what in large-scale transformations, how do you strike the right balance between standardization and allowing agencies to maintain processes that are critical to them?
Well, I mean, that is the huge question that I don't know that we could really answer that in the discussion with Aaron, and I don't know that I still can, to be honest. I mean, without having the right, I mean, first of all, if I back up, it all starts with project governance. I mean, how are you going to govern the project? How are you going to make decisions? Who's going to make decisions? What are the priorities? As far as if it comes down to it, and there's two or more different agencies or departments that have differing needs that conflict with one another, who decides? I mean, first of all, who decides who's right or wrong, or who takes precedent? Second of all, how do you get to that point, to where you bring that stuff to the surface? Because you do need to get that out. It's sort of like it's just a messy process with a lot of risk buried within it. And you've got to get that risk out on the table, out to the surface as quick as you can. Or else, it's just going to come up later, and it's going to be a lot more risky and expensive to fix it later, if you don't catch it soon enough. So I think it starts with project governance. It starts with working through your future state processes and really aligning on what those processes are going to be, because inevitably what will happen in this project is you are going to have however many dozens of different agencies, and you're just not going to come out with one clear answer on any business process, I would argue. I think every single process that they try to get alignment on, they're probably going to have a certain amount of misalignment, and you're just going to have to work through that. The key is, when do they work through that? Do they do it up front, before the meter starts running on the big, massive technical build out? Or do they end up deferring that and just waiting and see what happens when Cognizant's already there, billing by the hour? They've got an army of consultants there. And if you start working through that while the meter's running, and it takes you longer to make decisions as a result, that's where the time, and especially the budget, overruns and debacles happen, is because you couldn't make the decision. The meter keeps running on the project. You're still spending whatever you're spending each week and each month, but because you didn't figure that stuff out up front, now you're paying for it. You're basically paying to make decisions because you've got idle time while people are waiting for you to make those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I found really interesting, given that this is a government project, obviously, I liked the point about how you guys said at a high level, the government agencies have a shared mission to, serve their citizens. But once you really get into the project, you have to really get into the individual processes, and obviously resistance is inevitable once you get there. But this just made me think about how you can make people feel like they are a part of the bigger picture while still addressing their specific concerns. But I guess more specifically, a question for you: how can organizations like this effectively communicate that bigger picture benefit of a transformation while also addressing the concerns of the individuals?
Yeah, that is a tricky one as well, because I think, we talked about this with Aaron, where, it's probably fairly easy to align on the fact that we're all trying to make, if we're on this Matrix ERP project, we're all on the same page with what we want to accomplish as a government, as a governing body. We want the lives of UK residents to be better. We want them to be happier. We want them to have the resources they need. We want them to be safe. We want the UK to excel worldwide. All these different things that we could probably all agree on if we're part of the UK government. But once you start digging into like what you do day to day to contribute your small little part to that bigger vision, that's where the breakdowns happen, and that's where the misalignment happens. And that's where it gets real personal too, especially because, as we talked about, some of these different agencies have such different goals and objectives that all line up to the bigger picture goal, but the way you do it is so different. I think Aaron talked about the differences between the department or the Treasury Department versus the Department of Space. Those are such different, big picture goal. Yep, they're probably accomplishing the same thing, but when you get down to it, those are two very different, potentially conflicting sets of needs. So that it's a tough thing. And really the only way around it, in my opinion, is two things. One would be the project governance, which we've talked a lot about, getting the right project governance and decision-making processes in place. So it's very clear how decisions get made, who makes those decisions, who ends up being the mediator or arbitrator of what, the best answer is for the overall government, which is a very difficult job, I would imagine. So that's one, is that project governance and decision-making. Second would be just getting the future state processes out on the table as soon as you possibly can. And that starts with the current state, understanding what each of these entities are doing in their current state, and then quickly shifting to what is the future state going to look like. And that's where the real work happens or needs to focus, because that's where the discrepancies come in. That's where there's misalignments, not only between different departments, but also between the departmental needs and the technology itself. Keep in mind, we're talking about a SaaS-based product that doesn't have an infinite amount of flexibility. So you just aren't, even if you wanted to, you just aren't able to take Workday and customize it for each of these different departments. Or if you do, it's going to be really, really expensive and really risky. And I would argue you're probably not ever going to finish that project. So I think those two things, project governance and decision-making, getting the business process optimization work out on the table as early as possible so that you can get that alignment and work through that messy process up front, so that by the time you bring in Cognizant and all the technical implementers of the project, they have clear direction and there's a clear blueprint of how they're going to build technology.
Yeah, well, what a great conversation with Aaron. And to the audience, don't forget to look out for his new YouTube channel and his link. Go follow him on LinkedIn and on TikTok and Instagram.
Yeah, if you just search Aaron Patterson Third Stage, you'll find his content. We'll start pushing it out there more actively here in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, be sure to follow him on social media. So great conversation, and we're going to stick with this EMEA theme here, and we're going to talk about another big organization in the EMEA region. I want to play you this YouTube video clip that we recently published. It's about a massive SAP failure at a company called Spar Group, which is a food distribution company based in the EMEA region. They just implemented SAP. They spent $100 million on the project, and it did not go well. They had some issues, pretty significant issues, not only with the project itself, but with the operational impact and the disruption it caused on their operations after the fact. So we're going to roll this clip, which is going viral on YouTube. Anytime we publish something about failure, ERP failure, it tends to get a ton of traction. And I think this one's of particular interest because Spar Group is a very big, well-known company in the region. So we're going to play you this clip, and then we're going to talk about it here in just a second. But here's the case study in the inside the Spar Group SAP failure. So let's start with an overview of the SAP failure at Spar Group. As I mentioned, Spar Group is an $8 billion company. They do about $8 billion in annual turnover or revenue. They have retail operations, distribution operations, and some manufacturing facilities throughout the world based out of South Africa. And anytime a company like that, who's publicly traded, puts out a financial report and they mention their ERP project in the financial report, it's usually not a good sign. In January of 2025, the company published its financial results for the fiscal year 2024. And in that financial statement, they outlined a number of problems they had with their SAP implementation. First of all, they spent close to $100 million on the implementation, which is a staggering amount for any size company, even an $8 billion company. But what's even more alarming and shocking is that the company lost over $100 million in sales that it directly attributed to its SAP project. So in theory, the project cost not just $100 million, but $200 million in counting. In addition to the problems they had with lost sales, they also have had problems tracking their margins. They haven't been able to track their margins and optimize their margins, which, if you're familiar with the food and the retail industry, margins are very slim. So every tiny little bit of margin that you can get is a big deal. So for a company not be able to manage their important financial controls and the margins behind it, that's a big deal. The other issue that they had is they found that the warehouse management system of SAP didn't fill their needs. And they ended up having to scrap the WMS, or the warehouse management system, and revert to a third-party warehouse management system. So not only was the SAP implementation a disaster, but they had to diversify outside of SAP, which isn't a bad thing, but they found out the expensive and the hard way. And to add insult to injury, the SAP implementation had resulted in a lot of manual processes and actually increased their labor costs. And for those of you thinking about going through an SAP implementation, I'm going to speculate that you're probably doing the SAP implementation in the hopes or the expectation that you'll reduce your manual processes and reduce your labor costs, but that was not the case here with the Spar Group. So that raises the question, what can we take away from this? What lessons are there to be learned? And the good news is that there are some good lessons here, and it's not rocket science. So the things I'll share today are not super complicated. It may sound like common sense as I go through these things, but as we'll discuss, and as we've seen in this failure and other failures that we've studied, a lot of organizations and project teams make decisions that don't make a lot of sense at the time, but it's human behavior and organizational behavior that oftentimes leads to some of these decisions. So we'll talk about what those decisions and strategies are that undermine the project and talk about the things you could do to make your S4HANA implementation more successful. Now, if you're looking for more best practices to guide you through your S4HANA implementation, I want to share with you a book that we wrote that outlines some of the lessons we have from helping so many clients through their implementations, including some clients that had failed the first time around in their S4HANA implementation and hired us to come help fix the project. So we share a lot of these lessons with you in our guide to successful S4HANA implementations. You can download this guide for free by scanning the QR code right here. It'll give you a lot of best practices and tips to make sure that your S4HANA project is successful. So scan the QR code here, or you can go to the links below. In addition, you may also want to check out our Journey to S4HANA podcast series. It's a podcast that we started in 2024, and it features a number of industry best practices and experts and thought leaders to really help you learn from others on what it takes to make an S4HANA implementation successful. You can listen to or watch that podcast by going to journey2s4hana.com. When we look at the problems and evaluate the issues that Spar Group had in their implementation, it's clear that they didn't spend an adequate amount of time on their current state business processes. Because if they had focused on and understood their current state business processes adequately, they wouldn't have run into the problems they had. Most notably, the fact that they couldn't manage their margins and they couldn't get visibility into what their margins really were, whereas in their old legacy system they could. That tells you that there's a disconnect between the competencies and the processes and the workflows they had built up over time and the actual S4HANA implementation. Now, it's easy to say, well, we don't care about our current state because we want to move to a new technology and we want to adapt to new business processes. That's great. S4HANA can bring new capabilities to you, but there's probably a lot of things you're doing really well, and there's a reason you're doing some of the things you're doing, even if those processes are imperfect, or even if they're manual processes, or even if they could be improved. You still need to understand what they are so you understand the intent of what it is you need S4HANA to do for you. For example, when you look at the warehouse management system and how that warehouse system didn't work for the company and they ended up having to abandon SAP's warehouse management module, it was pretty clear that if they knew what the business processes were in their current state and what they expected to maintain and preserve in those current state processes, they would have known, or they should have known, that the SAP warehouse management system wasn't going to work for them. Same with the pricing analysis and the margin analysis that was so important to the company. The fact that they didn't understand that and bake that into the future state tells you that they either didn't understand their current state or they didn't adequately take that into consideration when they're designing the new system. So just because you're designing a new system and you're trying to define a new future state set of business processes doesn't mean you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and ignore the processes you have today. And as we'll talk about later in this video, without a current state understanding, your change management efforts are going to suffer as well. In addition to clearly understanding your current state and understanding what's working and what you're doing well in your current state, as well as what you're not doing well and what you want to improve in your current state, now you want to transition into fully defining your future state business processes. And you want to do this before you start implementing S4HANA. It's so common for organizations to say, we bought S4HANA, we know we're moving to S4HANA, let's just get the integrators in here and the technical consultants to come in and start designing and building stuff. Well, that's the wrong answer, because what happens is you're going to rush through decisions, or you're going to slow down decisions and it's going to slow down the project and delay it, or your consultants are going to make those decisions for you, and they're going to make those decisions in a vacuum without consideration of your strategy and what your needs and priorities are. So any one of those three things will happen if you don't do your future state up front. So that's why it's so important that you slow down before you start the project. A lot of companies want to dive in and just get going and start to speed things up, and they think that by skipping the assessment of future state processes and just jumping right into the technology, they think that's actually going to speed things up. And it does speed things up in the short term. It'll feel like you're making a lot more progress than you would otherwise. But what it's going to do inevitably is going to slow things down later in the future, and it's going to create a lot more headwinds and problems and misalignments and mismatches between business processes and technologies. And that's the sort of stuff that derails these projects. That's the sort of stuff that causes budgets to get out of control. And that's the sort of stuff that leads to the problems that Spar Group experienced here, which is not having a clear future state and not having a technology being delivered that addresses those future state business processes and requirements. The other thing that's important with clearly defining future state is that it allows you to create a very clear testing strategy, user acceptance testing. And by doing thorough user acceptance testing with your clearly defined future state processes, you should be exposing these sorts of issues that Spar Group had. So for example, when we look at these pricing and margin issues that they experienced, if they had clearly defined future state business processes and they had user acceptance testing scripts that match up to those future state processes, they would have caught this problem before they ever went live with S4HANA. they didn't catch those problems. So that tells me they probably didn't factor in those future state business processes into their test strategies for the system before they went live. So it's really important that you not only define the future state business processes, but you use those future state processes for user acceptance testing as well as training too. You want to clearly communicate to people and train people on what these new processes look like, and you can't do that unless you have the future state well defined. And I'm going to come back to this whole change management adoption issue here later in the video. When we think of SAP adoption and change management, more often than not, system integrators and SAP as a company and SAP consultants that are out there think of adoption as training. They think about just training people on how to use the new system, communicate to people how to use the new system. But really, this is a digital transformation. This isn't about SAP. It's not about S/4HANA. It's about your business and your processes. And SAP just happens to be the provider of technology that enables some of those business processes. So it's really important that we look at the people side of the equation, because we can't enable these new business processes without the people side of the equation being addressed. And the technology becomes worthless if people aren't using the system. And I would argue that no matter how much Spar Group had invested in change management, they were probably still going to fail if they hadn't addressed the other things I talked about earlier in this video. But change management is a way to draw out some of the issues and challenges and kinks in the processes and the technologies that are being deployed. I talked earlier about user acceptance testing and how important it is to base your user acceptance test scripts on your future state business processes that should be well documented. And by involving more people in that user acceptance testing from the business and following those future state business processes as part of their scripts for testing, that usually draws out issues and problems that inevitably happen as part of the design and the build of technology. Now, if Spar Group had invested in change management, that would have been another stopgap or a guardrail to catch some of these problems that they had. So the fact that they didn't catch these problems tells me they probably didn't invest super heavily or effectively in organizational change management. So it's really important to make sure that you invest heavily in change management. You invest in well beyond just training and communications that SAP or their system integrators might provide to you. There's a lot more that needs to happen starting on day one of your implementation, even in the phase 0 implementation planning phase. If you'd like to learn more about what you should be doing in that upfront phase of change management planning and the phase 0 piece of it, I encourage you to read our Guide to SAP Implementations. It's a guide that covers a number of best practices around how to make S/4HANA implementation successful based on us helping clients through so many of their implementations. You can read that guide by scanning this QR code right here or go to the links below. When SAP and their system integrator comes to you to talk about your S/4HANA upgrade, there's nothing they would love more than for you to say, I'm going all in on SAP and SAP's stack of technology. I'm going to deploy S/4HANA. I'm going to deploy some of the advanced tools like Ariba, Concur, SuccessFactors, Business Objects, a lot of other systems that SAP owns. And the reality is SAP and S/4HANA and some of the sister products that they have are not necessarily going to be the best fit for you. And that's something that Spar Group learned the hard way, especially with their warehouse management system. For a food distribution company where margins and efficiency are so important, and especially at scale for a large $8 billion company, warehouse management is a critical function of their operations and their supply chain. And if S/4HANA's warehouse management system can't handle those needs, then it's okay to go out and find a third-party bolt-on that you can integrate with S/4HANA. Now, SAP may tell you it's a bad idea, or the system integrator that's aligned with SAP might tell you that's a bad idea, but it's your business and you've got to find the technology that works best for you. And it's not just warehouse management, it's other functions and departments and workflows within your business that you want to make sure are aligned with what SAP can and can't do. And inevitably, you're going to find gaps in S/4HANA. You're going to find that there's certain things that it doesn't do well, or it doesn't do the way you want it to or you need it to. And that's okay, but you need to identify that stuff up front before you ever start the implementation so you can figure out a deliberate strategy of how to address that. Because you may decide you want a third-party bolt-on. You may decide you want to customize the software. You may decide that you want to change your business processes to fit the software, and you're okay with that. But whatever the case is, depending on the business process and the areas of gaps between the current state processes and what SAP can do, you want to make sure you have a deliberate strategy for how to address that. And you want to make sure that you've factored those risks and those activities into your implementation plan and budget, because those have a material effect on it. Now, it's easy to think you don't want to bring out the bad news or focus on the negative things as it relates to S/4HANA, but every ERP system, every technology is going to have downsides and risks. You just need to understand that up front rather than burying it or ignoring it, because it will come out eventually later in the implementation. So that YouTube clip you can find on my YouTube channel. That's where we talk about the case study here of Spar Group and their SAP implementation failure. Really interesting stuff, very common mistakes that we see a lot of organizations make. But what were some of your thoughts and takeaways from that discussion, Darian?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I feel like anytime we talk about failure, I feel like there's so many different lessons you can take away from it. And our audience also seems to really like it as well. One thing I really found interesting, though, was, if you have flexibility in solutions and the willingness to integrate third-party systems, when the primary solution doesn't meet the highlights of a pragmatic approach to a digital transformation, I think that is something that can really benefit a company. But I have some follow-up questions for you. What specific steps or methodologies do you recommend for companies to thoroughly assess their current business processes before launching an ERP implementation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, there's a lot you can do with not only the traditional, sort of whiteboarding or Visio diagramming current state processes, but there's also a tool that we use. It's a business process mining tool that allows you to quickly go into your current systems and see how fast, how long transactions are taking, the volume of transactions, the variances in your processes. A lot of times when you do those whiteboard sessions and you get a group of people together to talk about, how you're doing things step by step, a lot of times they have a vision of what they think it is, but then you do the process mining, which goes into the reality of what's actually happening in this current systems. And you find that, well, we defined one way, or we talk about one way of doing a certain workflow in our business process sessions. But then when we did the process mining, we see that there's actually 7 different ways that different parts of the company are doing. So it's a way to sort of add some quantitative reality to what's that more qualitative approach to business process management, business process definition. So I think if you could do both of those things, that could be a pretty powerful combination.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to kind of my comment earlier about third-party systems, given that Spar Group had to switch to a third-party warehouse management system, what advice do you have for companies when their chosen ERP system doesn't fully meet their operational needs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's going to happen to you. If you're on a project right now, that will happen. It's just a matter of when and where and how severe it is. But every organization we work with has this issue, and it's a trade-off. I mean, there's no perfect answer, and that's the problem. Is no matter what you do, it's not going to give you that feeling of, oh, that's a perfect answer. It's a silver bullet, whatever. All you can really hope for is you make the best answer, or maybe put it in another way, you make the least crappy decision. There might be, a few bad or a few ways you don't really want to pursue, but you've got to pick one. And so, for example, if you've got this disconnect between what you want your processes to be and what the technology can do, you have a few options. You could do the bolt-on approach, which is what Spar Group did, which is you go out and find an alternate system that can handle that one specific need, and then you bolt it onto or integrate it with the core ERP system. That's one option. You could customize the software if you wanted. I know it's a bad word and people don't like saying it, but you could, and a lot of organizations do. And there are times where customization is appropriate, but there's risk that goes with that, because now you're adding to the time and cost of the project. You're also adding to the risk of the project, because now you're changing the software the way it was built. But if it's important enough to you as a business, it might be worth that risk. And then the third option is that you can change your business processes to fit the way the software works, which obviously is easier said than done. For some of your business processes, you might be perfectly content with that. You might say, look, I know this isn't the way we do things today. I know it's not ideal, but you would have to frame it more tactfully than this. You wouldn't say these exact words, but essentially your business process isn't that important that we're willing to totally customize the software and change the way it was built. Obviously there's a more politically correct, tactful way to say that to your frontline employees, but that is an option. And so in some cases you can live with whatever limitations the software has, but in other cases you can't, in which case you need to choose one of the first 2 options, which are not perfect either. So those are really the 3 main options you have, but you've got to look at the cost benefit, sort of the pros and cons of each of them, and pick the one that makes the most sense.
Yeah, some great advice. And the video overall, I feel like there's so many lessons to be learned from it.
Yeah. And it's, that's why I like talking about failures, not because I like to be negative or scary or anything like that, but because when you look at what other people do, it's a lot easier for you, not for them, but for you, someone who wasn't on that project, it's a lot easier for you to learn from them and avoid some of those same mistakes, and apply those learnings to your project. And I think it helps. We could talk about it academically all we want in this podcast, but until you actually talk about what actually happens, in the heat of battle or in an actual implementation, it's all theoretical until you see what other organizations actually do and how they stumble and how they succeed as well. So
Yeah,
good stuff.
absolutely.
Well, good. Well, thanks for another great episode. This was fun, and it was fun. Even though we're talking about failure and challenging projects and risky projects, it was still hopefully something the audience got good value from. Thank you, Darian, for another great episode. Thank you to the audience for the great questions. Be sure to check out past episodes while you're waiting for next week's episode to come out. But past episodes you can find at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And we've got a great lineup of guests coming up. We've got next week, we'll have Scott Bickley from Infotech. We're going to talk about IT and ERP software vendor management. We're going to have Jan Bond on in a couple weeks. We're going to talk about a composable ERP. We'll talk about ERP failure case studies. In 3 weeks from now, we'll talk about data management and strategy with Khalid Morris. We're going to talk about one of our clients is going to be joining us in a March episode. To talk about some of their lessons from a project so far that we're helping them with. So a lot of good guests coming up here in the next few weeks. Be sure to bookmark the transformationgroundcontrol.com website or subscribe to it on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen or watch the podcast. And we'll be back next week. Hope you have a great week in the meantime, and we'll see you soon. Take care.